Welcome to Shapes of Grief, listeners. I'm delighted today to be joined by Kate Shannon. Kate, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks a million for having me today.
So Kate is joining me to tell about her beautiful son, Leo, who died following a medical termination in 2018. And Kate would like to talk about the organisation Llanov Macree, which for overseas listeners in Irish, that means child of my heart. And I can feel already the charge that comes around when we have to make that impossible decision to terminate a much wanted pregnancy and lose a much wanted child. I have spoken to someone about this before in the podcast, Hayley Manning. That was right at the beginning. Hayley lost her beautiful little daughter, Luna. So thank you, Kate, for bringing up this theme again. And it's a topic that's not discussed nearly often enough. And yet there's many people in Ireland and abroad who are grieving a much wanted child that they've had to lose through medical termination. So Kate, maybe take us back to 2017 and what was going on in your life then?
Well, I had a daughter in 2016, Sadie, and she's now 4. And when she was about 16 months old, it was quite a surprise, but a very much delighted surprise. I found out I was pregnant again. And I just kind of swung straight into the pregnancy. I was delighted. I was bouncing around the place with joy. I really, really was. And I can still remember that joy very much. And my husband was delighted. We said, we'll just roll with the punches. We'd have 2 under 2, but sure, isn't that kind of the way? And, I went through the pregnancy with less anxiety than I had done with my pregnancy on Sadie. Just going back a step further, in 2015, I actually miscarried in my second trimester on my first baby. And so my pregnancy on Sadie was quite anxious. But when I got pregnant with Leo, my then third pregnancy, I was just thrilled with myself. I felt great. I felt like I could do it without all the sort of, I'd had a lot of interventions with Sadie, it was heavily scanned and just to keep me at ease during that pregnancy. And in March of 2018, I was coming up to my 20 weeks. Everything had been great up until that point. And it was just during the big snow, quite specifically, I recall it, and most people will, in Ireland. And we were snowed in, so my scan was actually postponed for a week later than it should have been. So by the time I actually got myself into the hospital, I was actually by myself. I decided to go alone. That was how confident I was feeling. And I basically got the most horrific news you could ever get during your pregnancy, and it just went downhill from there. It was like it was just a massive shock to my whole body when I was told there was something wrong. And the sonographer, when she was scanning me, she went very quiet, like they all do. And I'd actually been there before in a previous pregnancy, so it felt familiar, but yet grossly unfamiliar. And I couldn't believe the sort of injustice of having this a second time round in a different way. So
the first time had been just prior to your miscarriage. Had you had a scan and were told that there was no heartbeat and then you miscarried?
Yeah, so in 2015, I had a scan on my first pregnancy at 19 weeks and there was no heartbeat. I then delivered that baby. He was a little boy as well, at 20 weeks. And so it was very triggering, but I was in such a good place mentally on this third pregnancy, having had a child, a healthy, happy child. I thought that I was kind of, I was unaware, and I hadn't even heard of fatal fetal diagnoses or severe diagnoses. I hadn't actually heard, I was just completely naive. And so naive was I that I went alone, like I said, and the doctor came in and confirmed that Leo was actually, he had severe hydrocephalus, which is fluid around the brain. And my husband had then joined me by that stage, and
You had
we
done an
then,
SOS call to him, did you?
yeah, a horrific
Yeah.
call. I don't
Mm.
remember it, but he does, very much so. And he raced into the hospital to join me, and we then went down to radiography, and I was actually going to have an MRI just to get a better picture of the baby's brain. And it then confirmed what the doctor then called ventricular malaise, which is when all of the four ventricles of the brain are surrounded by fluid. And, you know, trying to ask what this meant, that was all the questions that were coming and flooding in after that diagnosis. You don't really take anything in. You just kind of are in total shock, and you have no idea what it means. And you get kind of glimpses into the future, really
Mm.
sharp, horrific kind of what's happening. You think of, actually, one of the first things I thought of was Sadie, my child at home. What does this mean for her? That was one of my biggest things. It wasn't really about me. And I kept thinking of, how pregnant I was. I felt so pregnant. I was 22 weeks. I felt him kicking. He was normal size. He had all of his limbs. His other organs were working so far as they could see on the scan. It was just his brain. And, then the kind of research started, and my husband asked the more difficult questions with the doctor, because I couldn't. What are our choices? And when I heard even the word choice all the way back then, it didn't mean what it means to me now, which is so
Yeah.
different.
Mm.
And luckily he asked those questions, and our doctor at the time, and this is pre-referendum, obviously, he was very open and supportive.
And maybe just for the sake of our overseas listeners, Kate, would you explain what you mean by pre-referendum?
Okay. So abortion has only been made legal since a referendum which took place in May 2018, and then made legal officially in January 2019. And so for women who have fatal fetal diagnosis in pregnancy, they can now have an abortion in Ireland under the care of their hospital. But at the time of my diagnosis with Leo, or his diagnosis, should I say, it was March 2018. So we had to travel because we had no other option. Um, Even actually today, I would still have to travel because his diagnosis was not fatal. It was just extremely severe. And so it's a little bit more complex, and the decision is quite heartbreaking. But ultimately, we feel and believe that we made the right decision. It was a compassionate decision. It was for him. It wasn't for us. We would not have had what the medical doctors described to us as a take-home baby who would live a happy, healthy, or anywhere near. Usually babies who are born with ventricular malaise as severe as Leo, they normally don't survive up until 2, if they survive. And his case was so
Mm.
severe that it was a really poor outcome for him. So,
He'd never
we
have
made
been
the
able to
decision.
eat by himself or possibly breathe by himself.
No, no.
Mm.
He would have had a permanent tube going into his head to remove fluid. He probably would have been blind, deaf, and dumb, and wouldn't have been able to do anything for himself. So it was very much a decision that we made as a little unit of 3. We were thinking of Sadie, we were thinking of Leo, and how unfair that it would have been to have
Mm.
brought a baby into the world. And it just wasn't right to us.
So
And
it
so
would
the
have been like
decision is
prolonging his death rather than prolonging his life. He was going to
exactly,
die eventually for sure,
yeah,
and at a very young
yeah,
age, before toddlerhood. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But we, of course, researched it. We did everything in our power, and I was lucky to, my mum used to be a nurse, and she has friends in Norway, and medical friends. And I got in touch with a doctor over there. This is how desperate we were. We just wanted every fragment of information that we could simply put together to just tell us we were doing the right thing for him. And I spoke to a doctor overseas, and he 100%, he saw my scans. I spoke to the pediatrician and neurologist in Temple Street. He looked at my scans. They all confirmed the diagnosis, number one, and how severe it was. So it was, yeah, with a really heavy heart. I mean, desperate. It was a desperate couple of weeks. And
Yeah, tell me about coming to that decision, Kate. You know, you say you went in like so naive and innocent, and I love that having lost a child, you were able to regain that innocence, because often we're quite plagued with anxiety after a child has died, or if we lose a pregnancy. Just the confidence and the assurance you had to have it shattered all over again must have been just beyond belief for you. But at what point did you realize Leo's not going to be the baby we thought we were going to have?
I think it was when it really came to me when we had to travel overseas and we went to London. And there's quite a stark difference in how a woman is sort of presented and treated with this kind of thing. And they're used to welcoming Irish women over. And it just, I talked to so many more doctors, and we were met with bereavement midwives. We had phenomenal care. Like it was just incredible. Whereas in Ireland, when we were talking about it at home, it was barely mentioned. Words like termination and horrible words that conjure up images and scariness for women who are pregnant, like really sharp, stark realities of, you will be, giving birth to a baby who is not alive. And these kind of things were made more real to me in the UK, in London, and not in the most kindest way, in the most compassionate way. And it almost helped normalize the experience, and made me feel not so alone and isolated, because I felt cared for and held in that space with them.
And in Ireland, were you given access to a bereavement midwife?
There was a bereavement midwife that I had access to, but she wasn't a huge part of my process. I actually remember the midwives more in the UK and their names. It just wasn't what I personally think it should be. I know they're trying their best, or did their best within the legislation at the time, but it hit home really, that what I was doing was right for us and for my baby and our family. And it just felt more normalized. Like, I know it's not the right word really to use, but it makes it feel like, okay, I'm here, I'm being looked after, and this is okay.
Well, it's a good
Even
word,
though it is not
normalizing,
okay.
this situation, which can happen. It is a condition, whereas in Ireland it was almost criminalized, and hushed tones and legislation. Are we breaking legislation? Are we, abiding by the law? There's this sort of sense of, what can we do? What shouldn't we do? And in that, a grieving mother gets dropped between the cracks, and yet again, somebody else has to get on a plane in the midst of the trauma and the grief and fly to another country. So what happened once you're in the UK, Kate?
Well, I think actually what you said there is so true, is when you actually have to fly to another country, it just absolutely multiplies the trauma of the event. I mean, even though I got wonderful care in the UK, and when we arrived, we were so lucky because I have family in London. So my brother is there. He's no longer there now, but my aunt and my cousin were there to actually greet us, and they let us stay with them. And my auntie was actually with me and my husband Danny for the birth, which was quite special, because I couldn't have my mum with me or any of my friends. Whereas now, when in Ireland, if a woman is having a termination for a medical reason, their families can actually go visit the baby afterwards, and we couldn't do that. We didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
um so that was very, very difficult.
In
That
just a
was
few months
painful.
as well, it's changed, Kate. It's like
Mm.
you were probably one of the last people in your circumstances that would have to travel to the UK.
Yeah, that's right, Liz. But unfortunately, there still are women traveling, because of the legislation. It doesn't cover a diagnosis that's severe. It's only fatal. So a baby that would not live past, I think it's up to 28 days of birth. But in saying that, um, I do feel that even having abortion legalized to some extent in Ireland is a stepping stone in the right
Mm.
direction.
Mm.
Um,
So back to your birthing process over in
yeah,
the UK, and you gave birth to this little boy.
yeah. It was actually, in a weird way, quite a beautiful thing, because we were very frightened going into the birth. I'd had a previous section on Sadie, and so they were just aware of my. They didn't want me to have a uterine rupture, so I had to kind of be induced very, very slowly. Um, Prior to that, I'd actually had the feticide, which is an injection that stops the baby's heart. And that was very traumatic. It's just like two separate events. There was the
Mm.
feticide, which is 2 days before the labor, and then I had the full labor. Um, and that's quite traumatic. And
Even
we
the
don't forget
word.
those.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a horrible word.
Mm.
And but the labor in one way was a relief, and it was actually quite a triumph for me personally, because I hadn't experienced like a vaginal birth. So I was really happy with myself, and I was like, wow, I can do this. And the midwives were just amazing. And, I was going through these contractions, and like I was eating pizza that my aunt had brought up from just, down the road. We were joking, we were laughing, because you have to have some sort of escape when
Yeah.
that really is happening
Yeah.
in the room. It's quite intense otherwise. And then later on, as the labor intensified and my contractions were really, really strong, I was very emotional. And my aunt had gone home, and I remember crying out for her. And my husband was there, and I knew that we both needed support in the final hours of it. And we had a wonderful midwife. And then my auntie arrived, and then just 4 hours later, Leo was born, I think at 7:10 a.m. And he was actually born in his sack, which is quite a beautiful and special thing. But I was very, very out of it at that point. And I know this is quite hard listening for some people, but I'd been on been on pain relief, and the pain relief had made me very ill. So I was actually vomiting as well. It was quite intense, and
Mm.
as all childbirth is, I mean, there's no denying that. So when he was born, it was a huge relief, and immediately they asked me, did I want to hold him? But I actually didn't. I needed time. I was very sick still and
Mm.
completely shattered. We'd been up all night. But they did take him away, and they dressed him, and they put him in a little kind of bed. And then they wheeled him into me. And that was when I saw him first.
And how was that moment for you, Kate? I can imagine the charge of it.
Mm. It was certainly unforgettable. You don't forget something like meeting your baby for the first time. Obviously, I noticed how small he was, but yet how much of a baby he was. And he looked to me like just this gorgeous little thing. Um, and then I noticed that he had a lot of swelling around his head, and they had said that that would be apparent to me when I saw him. And I didn't really feel much except complete shock as well. It's quite a surreal moment,
Mm.
and you're not really quite sure how to react. I didn't have tears. I wasn't you know, I was just sort of numb actually. But it was unforgettable, I will say that. And I did hold him. Um, and looking back now, I wish I held him longer, but I think every mother would say the same thing. It never is long enough, really.
Yeah.
But after we got to hold him, we took pictures of him, and we also got footprints. My aunt she was sort of our advocate, because Danny was completely exhausted and
Mm.
in shock, and went kind of very quiet, and he didn't really know what to do either. But so my aunt was our sort of advocate, and she was talking to midwives for us and organizing the feet printing and all of these lovely things. It was just a whirlwind to me. I don't remember saying much. And then we were talking about how we were going to take him home, and we decided to have him cremated in the UK, and then his ashes will be brought back to me, which
Mm.
they are with me now, obviously. Um, that was a hard decision too.
And would there have been other options, Kate? Would you have been able to bring your baby's body back to Ireland? And would you have had to
Yeah.
jump through hoops to do that?
I think on reflection of it now, um, it would have been harder to bring his body back, and many women do choose this. It's a very individual thing, and I was quite detached from the decision-making process. I actually was so exhausted and so shocked that I really didn't understand the decisions I was making. I can only
Mm.
describe it like that. It was just, I was picking stuff. I was like, okay, we'll do that. That'll be fine. Um, if it was now, I don't know. Knowing what I know now, maybe I would choose to bring his body back and to have a ceremony or do something. But at the time, I think we chose what was right for us at that time.
Yeah, yeah. And Kate,
You only go with what you got.
from the day that you went into the hospital in the snow to having Leo cremated, what sort of time period are we looking at?
He, I was 22 weeks, 21 weeks actually on my scan, just nearly 22. And he was 24 weeks. It was about a 3-week period. He was
Right.
just 24 weeks when he was born.
And I think
Exactly.
key to this is the whirlwind and the trauma and the stress for you. You know, there isn't really a point in these moments where you feel grounded and with it and making clear decisions. Like, it is really, really traumatic to get this diagnosis. And we so badly need advocates for us and professional people and medical people who can really hold and carry us as well as deliver the clinical information to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a lot to be said for getting, you get when you're going through this, you get a lot of physical knowledge, like what is going to happen. Yet it doesn't really describe really what happens, because it's such a conflict on your body. And
Yeah.
even even months after I'd experienced this, I felt quite disconnected to my body, my physical body. Like I felt, first of all, I was missing my pregnancy, and the feeling of having a baby in my womb, which is so unique. And even I would have to put a hot water bottle on my tummy just to feel a weight, or like a
Mm.
blanket or a pillow or something. I felt so robbed of something. And so you're trying to kind of work out in your own mind what all that means. And it's quite heavy going, and it does take a toll. And I sort of hid for a while, and I went to counseling, which was wonderful. I'm so grateful that I did make that decision, because it's brought me to where I am now,
Mm.
um, which is actually a place of being really grateful for my journey with Leo.
And
I've learned so
where was
much
the
from it.
counselling? Was it private, or was there a service that was offering that in Dublin?
I went to private counselling.
Okay.
A friend literally sent me a number one day, and I ended up 2 weeks after. I
Yeah.
was in my counsellor's room, and that was where my counselling process
So again,
began.
it's a service only for the privileged, for people who can afford it.
That's
There's
right,
many women
yeah.
who come home and just can't.
They
Kate,
can't.
I'm curious about, I can imagine Leo in the call, isn't that what we say in Ireland when they're born, in their sack? I think the
Mm,
fishermen say it's good luck for fishermen or something. But I'm
they do,
struck by
yeah.
this image of Leo in his sack. Um, and I've worked with several women who've had a baby who's died at birth or just before birth. And all of them have described just how the baby lies there between their legs, and none of them have picked up the baby
Mm,
in the immediacy. Could you
no.
talk a little bit more? I mean, you said you were very sick and you were out of it, and
Mm,
really understand that you're just trying to survive. Sometimes it is a matter of maternal survival, isn't it? There's something poignant about, you know, when we have a child, we think the first thing we want to do is skin to skin and get the baby up. And when we know our baby's not going to be alive,
mm,
what's that like? Because we grieve them as though they were alive, and we know them and love them and want them.
mm.
I'm curious to
Yeah.
know, is there something there about the reluctance to hold them?
I think it's facing it. You know,
Mm,
I think holding a dead baby is one of the most difficult things you can ever do. And you don't want to pick up your dead baby because it's really facing that harsh, really cold reality of what has really happened. And in fact, when I actually delivered him, my aunt looked at him and told me he was in his sack. I couldn't even look.
yeah.
So it wasn't, I physically couldn't. And I think it's a protection as well for
Mm,
yourself, and you may not want those memories on an unconscious level. I don't know consciously how I'd feel about it now. Maybe I should have, maybe I should. There's no should or would, it just did not happen.
yeah.
I did not have that
Yeah.
urge. But you afterwards, you do want to go back and pick them up and hold them. But it's very different when you're in that moment. For some women, I'm not sure. I think it might be an individual thing again, but it's there is a definite reluctance, and yet a sort of on a cognitive level, you should, because you think it's good for you. I need to pick up my baby, I need to
Mm,
hold them and um, mourn them and love them, even though you do. It's just difficult.
mm. So back to little Leo, and he was brought into you, and he'd been washed and he'd been dressed,
Mm,
and he was in a little cot. What do you
mm.
remember about that time?
Well, I remember he was in this kind of little outfit, like little silk outfit, and there was a blanket, and the blanket was blue. So immediately I was like, yes, he's a boy. Um, and we still have that blanket, actually. And I remember feeling, and he was very cold, which is quite significant, and very light, very, very light, and almost fragile, like I couldn't hold him. And actually, when I did hold him, I was still very sick from the drugs, and I actually got sick, and it was very scary. Yeah, I screamed out to the midwife, please take him, I'm going to get sick. And again, it
Mm,
could be connected to that. I can't actually face this. This was too much for me and my
yeah,
body at that time.
yeah.
And just being accepting of that at the same time.
Did you spend much time with Leo?
We spent the day with him, um, and then we went home and I slept. We went home to my aunt's apartment and I slept for solidly. I just went into a deep sleep
Mm,
in the evening time. And the next day, I was on a train going to the airport, and I remember feeling, it was also snowing in England, And I remember looking at the people on the tube on the way to the airport and thinking they have no clue what I've just done. And I was still bleeding and in pain, very much in pain still, after having just delivered a baby the day before. And I don't remember the days after that, actually. I don't remember coming home to Dublin. And I don't remember mothering my daughter. And she was actually, I had to leave her for 5 days, which was quite distressing as well. I left her with my mum and dad. And so coming home to that was a blur. You're absolutely exhausted with childbirth and with the grief. And you can't really speak, or you can't really articulate what you want or need. But you just need a lot of space. But 17-month-old babies don't really give you that. So
Yeah.
I didn't get a lot of that, but I managed somehow.
How did the experience of mothering Leo and losing Leo change you, Kate?
Oh, it's changed me massively. I feel very different to how I did back then. It's been monumental. I'm very I think I think I am a better mother to my daughter in many different ways because of the journey I've been on with him. I have definitely learned so much about myself, and I've learned about people and the human experience and how it can change how you see the world, basically in a whole new way. And I'm glad of that. I'm really glad of that. I'm glad that I see it differently. I'm glad that I can also help other women in this situation, which is so horrific. And just be with them or talk to them or just tell them that, I'm here.
And you do that in your capacity as volunteer for Lanark McCree, is that right?
Yes. So shortly after coming home from the UK, I actually was trying to find other women who'd been through this by simply Googling women in Ireland who've had a termination for a medical reason. It was that sort of, I didn't know what else to begin with. And because of the campaign for the repeal, for the referendum against abortion, I came across the group Lanark McCree, Child of My Heart, in English, and they basically helped me completely in so many ways I can't even describe. It was just having other women who'd been through this just made my experience feel so valid, and I knew they got it. I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel ashamed of my decision. I didn't feel guilt, like I'd done something wrong. And the person that I actually spoke to had the same experience, and she actually rang me and spoke to me, and I was put on a WhatsApp group, and a couple of months later I was at a support group meeting in Naas and in Dublin, and it just went from there. So a couple of years later, I think it's 2.5 years later, I decided to become a volunteer for Lanark McCree because I feel so passionately about it. And I really believe that what they do is just incredible for women. And I'm so grateful to them. So it's just giving back, and anything that I can do, I will.
How important, Kate, do you think it is for people who've had a bereavement to find other people with a similar bereavement? How important was it for you to meet other women who'd also had a termination for medical reason?
Well, I think it was quite significant for me personally, just because I knew nobody. And so it just opened up this whole new world of, for the first time ever, feeling like it's a sense of belonging as well. Like, okay, I have somewhere to go with this. I'm not on my own. I didn't feel isolated. I felt like these women understood me without fear and judgment. And I just think it's so important for women who have gone through a termination for medical reason to have a place, a safe space without judgment, where they can get unconditional support in their decision-making process, or when they've actually lost their baby after a termination for medical reason.
Yeah. And does it help you with your healing as well, to volunteer with others?
Yeah, it's quite a healing journey. I mean, to be honest with you, it started really when I wanted to become a counselor after going through my counseling, my personal counseling. And so I decided to train as a counselor, which I'm in the middle of now. And then Lanif McCree has always been there. Like, I've always been on the WhatsApp support group for special dates, like you know, when women are trying to make memories for their babies, that they want to make memories on anniversaries or their due date. And the WhatsApp group was just immensely helpful for those. Like, so you'd just be having a big rant about something that you just felt miserable about on a particular day, and somebody would always reply and be like, I know what you mean. And, you know, it's just a great camaraderie as well. And so to be able now to give back to that is just, it's wonderful. And it kind of just comes in at the right time for me, because I'm doing my counselor training as well. So it just all felt right. And also as well, I'm just at the right time in my journey where I feel able to do that emotionally. Like, I'm able to talk about my story without becoming, you know, very upset. Which is important, because if I wasn't, I wouldn't be able to support other women. And there are obviously still times where I do get upset about Leo, particularly on, you know, the month that he was born, and particular dates, or, you know, scenarios. Like, I really don't like the snow, for example, because of my scan was in the snow. And so things like that I'll still get upset about, but I'm able to I'm able to sort of have my safe space.
It doesn't fully hijack you.
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't, yeah.
And Kate, I'm curious about your first little boy, born at 19 weeks, and also a fully formed little baby at that stage. What was his name, and how did that differ from Leo?
Well, we called him Arnie, but actually we didn't name him until a year ago. It just organically happened. It was very different. It was 5 years ago now, and it was my first pregnancy, and I went to my scan, and they couldn't find a heartbeat, and it was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. And I think the difference for me, there's no real difference in the pain and the loss that you feel, but there just isn't the huge trauma attached to it, with a termination for medical reason, and the added layer of having to travel. And for a while I was going to support meetings for women who've had miscarriages, and I made wonderful friends with women who've had loss in that way. And it did bring me into that world and it did change me. But what really was quite evident to me when I lost Leo was that I realized I hadn't grieved my first baby. And so the grief came tumbling in. And I was actually grieving for two babies. And that was quite of a roller coaster for me. And I didn't let myself grieve because I got pregnant very quickly again.
With Sadie.
With Sadie.
And with Arnie, did you hold him? Did you meet him?
I did, but we didn't hold him. He was quite small. He was actually dated. I gave birth to him at 19 weeks. I think I was nearly 20, but he was actually much smaller. So he had stopped growing, and they think it was something to do with my placenta. That we did tests, but nothing was conclusive, as in so many cases of miscarriage. But I was again in a sort of a limbo place, because in the hospital I was in, there was no ward for women who have miscarriage in the second trimester. And so I was actually on the labor ward with women who were giving birth at full term. So it was very upsetting. And I actually was quite sick after as well. I got a uterine infection. I
Mm.
was in and out of the hospital. It was not nice. I'll say that. Very, very sad time in our lives.
Mm. I'm so sorry that Arnie and Leo aren't here today, Kate. And I'm so glad that you've got counselling, that you went and you got the support you needed, that's brought you to where you are today, because a lot of women don't, and it can catch up in time. Where are these little boys for you now in your family, Arnie and Leo?
Yeah.
How do you
Well,
keep connected to them?
it's really, I suppose it's just about keeping them present in their ever absence. Um, you just have to keep saying their name and remembering them. And sometimes it still hurts when other people say their name, but I'm also so glad that they did. And I always would love to tell people who are supporting women who are grieving a baby to always say their name. It's just so important, because it just makes them so real and that they were in our lives. And it just, it's probably one of the biggest things I could say to people is just say their name, even to your partner or your if you have children living. And we felt really strongly about talking about Leo to Sadie. Um, and I actually felt that later on, when she grew up into a toddler, that she actually was very aware of him, and she would talk about him in through play with
Yeah,
her dolls and teddies. And whilst that was really sad for me and really hard to watch, and a lot of my friends were then going on to have their number twos, there was a lot of babies around me as well, which has its own uh, troubles and, you know,
yeah.
brings up a lot of emotion. But Sadie, watching Sadie play and mention Leo was wonderful. It was, yeah, it just keeps his memory alive.
And it wasn't just a figment of your imagination, that I think that's a theme I hear a lot is, if his name isn't mentioned, did he almost ever exist? And particularly if other people didn't get to meet him or hold him because you weren't able to give birth in your own country. So,
yeah,
you know, it's probably important to you that your aunt was there and your aunt witnessed his birth
yeah,
and got to meet him also. Makes it all a little bit more real.
it did for sure. Just making the experience real,
Mm,
you know, and even looking at pictures of him two to 2.5 years on, is it keeps his memory alive. And you know, my husband and I always say, like, we wouldn't be where we are today in our lives without him, even though he's not here. So he's given us a lot. We've learned and we've grown so much from losing him. And I think that's what happens in grief. You just try your best to make as much meaning out of life as you can. And you do ask a lot of existential questions as well,
mm,
because especially around the scenario of his death, you know, I never questioned my decision. I never did. But I felt other people questioned my decision, which made me feel like I couldn't talk about it to people.
yeah,
Um, and I do feel comfortable in enough now to talk about him and to say his name and to tell people about how he died, um, because of the journey that I've been on and the growth that I've done.
yeah. And Kate, if there was somebody listening who was facing into a similar scenario as you went through with Leo, what words of wisdom would you offer them?
God, I don't know if I have words, but I would just sit with them, I guess, and let them know that what they're going through is extremely tough, and just to mind themselves. I think self-compassion during
Mm,
the whole time of losing a child or anybody in your life is probably the most important thing. And I probably didn't know it enough back then. So minding yourself, you know,
yeah,
just saying no. Oh my goodness, that is so powerful, to be able to say no to a baby shower or even a wedding. Who, you know, if you don't want to celebrate something, don't go. Don't go to the supermarket. Get somebody to drop your shopping to the door. let friends help you. If you feel like you can't talk to anybody, then I would say get in touch with a counsellor, or a support group like Lanark McCree.
Yeah, great. Words of wisdom, Kate. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story today. And yeah, best of luck with little Sadie, and for keeping those bonds with Leo and
Thank you so
Arnie,
much. Thank
and
you.
for your studies. And no doubt your experience will make you an excellent counsellor for people who are facing loss, especially early loss.
Thank you so much. Thanks so
Yeah,
much for having me.
such a pleasure, Kate.